Behind me is a portion of the Saratoga battlefield. Saratoga is uh, north of New York by, I would guess, about 100 miles, maybe a little bit more, north of Albany, now that I think about it, and was the scene of one of the most important battles of the War for American Independence. We'll get to it in a bit. But what's important to bear in mind right now is that the the Americans had declared independence. They actually, for a brief shining moment, had complete independence everywhere. The revolutionaries had taken control of the governments of all 13 former colonies, now states. Um, and the British, had evacuated Boston and hadn't come back, but everybody knew that they were going to come back. George Washington knew where they were going to come back to. Anybody with any kind of military analytical powers knew where the British were going to return, and they returned, as you might guess on your own, to New York. The finest harbor on the East Coast, one of the greatest harbors in the world, strategically placed to maximize British military advantages if they could get control over New York. And the British began to land on Long Island outside of New York a few weeks after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And what goes on from then until 1781 is a military struggle to preserve this independence against a determined British effort to recover what it regarded as the 13 colonies. I'm going to share the screen with you. Okay. We'll talk about Continental Army operations in 1776 to start with. In the summer of 1776, there was a major campaign in and around New York. And the Continental Army there had 20,000 men to start with. The British captured New York City, and in one of the battles that preceded that, Washington's army was nearly trapped and destroyed. And from then on, Washington never risked a decisive battlefield loss. Again, the overall American strategy was to maintain that Continental Army in existence. So you might lose New York, you might lose Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress met. You might lose any city. The important thing, though, was you were not going to lose the Continental Army. It was going to remain a force in being. But it almost lost being a force in being just because of demoralization and the expiration of enlistments and soldiers choosing not to re-enlist. And by December 1776, Washington's army numbered only about 2,000 men. This army had retreated from New York into Pennsylvania in the direction of Philadelphia. It was on the shores of the Delaware River. Winter had set in. There was ice on the Delaware River. The soldiers were underfed. They were ill-clad. Their shoes, in some cases, were falling apart. They were desperately cold, and the situation was truly dire. Washington believed that only a military victory could keep the Continental Army from dissolving altogether. And so he decided on an attack on a Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey, which was right across the river from where his army was. And these Hessians were mercenary troops from the German Principality of Hesse. And basically, the Prince of Hesse would hire out these highly professional, very skilled soldiers to whoever wanted them. And right now, George III of Great Britain wanted them quite badly, and so these Hessian soldiers were shipped across to fight alongside the British soldiers, and there was this garrison right across the river at Trenton, New Jersey. Now, um, crossing the Delaware River, though, in the depths of winter, and this is a demoralized force. 2,000 men is all. They are cold. They're shivering in encampments and so forth. The Hessian garrison is snug in its in quarters, in cabins and houses and so forth in Trenton. And what Washington is going to do is to attack this garrison. He does it at night, and this is a very romantic view of the crossing of the Delaware River. And it was almost, certainly nothing like this. It happened at night. It was an extraordinary feat to ferry 2,000 men, even 2,000 men, across the Delaware River at night without the Hessians finding out, and then without resting, even for a little bit, marching directly, the several miles to Trenton to fight the Hessian garrison. And you can kind of have some fun with this. I've seen this meme a few times on Facebook, and I always like it. Americans willing to cross a frozen river to kill you in your sleep on Christmas, actually December 6th, 26th. Totally not kidding. We've done it. And we have, and we did. The Continental Army surprised the Hessian garrison at Trenton, captured most of it, did not lose a single casualty, and so won this really a symbolic victory. It didn't change the military situation at all, but this Continental Army that was about to fall apart, it had won, this victory that was encouraging, that gave them renewed confidence in their ability to fight the enemy and to win. And then Washington shortly went off and dealt with another Hessian garrison at nearby Princeton. Again, minor operations militarily, but very important in their effect on morale. And I think if there's one point where the Americans could have lost the war for American independence outright, would have been had Washington not dared to cross the Delaware River, or had that attempt to cross been a disaster. But by no means was it going to gain independence for the new United States. Now, the next spring, 1777, the major action occurred in New York, and the British plan. Look at the map on the left hand side. The British plan actually was to have one army under a guy named John Burgoyne, come down south from Canada. And you could do this pretty easily. You could supply yourself along Lake Champlain. So you had, boats to supply you and so forth. And then there was a smaller force that came from Lake Ontario under a guy named St. Leger, and he moved eastward. And then the British Army at New York was supposed to move north up the Hudson River. And then all three of these columns were going to combine in the vicinity of Albany. And so what this would have done would have been, it would have cut New England off from the other colonies. It would have completed the capture of New York, another important state, and it would have gone a long way toward ensuring a British victory. But it didn't work out that way. The British Army in New York did not move north up the Hudson the way it was supposed to. It headed off to Philadelphia. Instead, Burgoyne faced more opposition than he expected. And in October 1777, his army was not only defeated, but surrounded and forced to surrender, about 5,000 troops. And, this was an important victory in its own right, but it was even more important because the Americans had been looking to conclude a military alliance with France for some time. Uh, and, and Saratoga convinced the French that the Americans could win, and that if they allied themselves with the Americans, it would be a good opportunity to defeat the great, to defeat the British, um, and because they were in it for themselves, they weren't necessarily interested in American independence for its own sake. Um, so, so let's talk about this alliance with France because it is really crucial. Another way that it becomes easy to imagine the Americans losing the war for independence is if they had not gotten the assistance of France from France that they did. Now, France was already giving the United States some clandestine support. In fact, some of the artillery used at Saratoga had been supplied by the French. And the French motive when they concluded the alliance was mainly to influence their strategic situation in Europe. It wasn't payback for the loss of New France, during the French and Indian War. And the alliance specified no separate peace, which basically meant that the Americans would continue to fight until till the French were ready to conclude a peace treaty. They weren't supposed to conclude a peace treaty with the British while the French were continuing to fight, and vice versa. And then it expanded the war so that Great Britain now had to fight in Europe, not on land, but mostly naval campaigns against France, Spain, eventually the Dutch Republic. And then Great Britain also had to defend its possessions in the Caribbean Sea, especially the Sugar Islands that generated more wealth than the North American colonies. Now, the French dispatched a small expeditionary force to the colonies or the states. It was deliberately kept small to avoid the perception that France might attempt to take over the colonies. I mean, after all, just a few years earlier, the French had been, the enemy. In fact, they had been historically the enemy of the Americans since 1689 when the colonial wars began. French naval power in North American waters, though, meant that Great Britain no longer had uncontested command of the sea. Now, having said that, a lot of the French naval effort took place in the Caribbean Sea, and the British fleets were down there, and they were fighting the British were fighting to defend their Sugar Islands, and the French were fighting to seize these Sugar Islands and so forth. So the French weren't always in North American waters, but they could be, and they compromised British command of the sea. But above all, and this is the crucial thing, there were lavish amounts of French gold made it possible for the first time for the Second Continental Congress to operate on a secure financial business. So that if you needed to buy supplies from a merchant, it was no longer, hey, here's this Continental dollar, we'll pay, it's good. We're going to pay it in gold after the war, after we win the war. No longer that. It was just like, hey, you want payment in gold? Here's the gold, and it's all supplied by France. Lots and lots and lots of it. In the meantime, the British, have a problem. They have tried and failed to win the war, in New England. They have failed in New York. They have failed to gain any kind of decisive success, even though they captured Philadelphia at one point. It was just the Continental Army was there, and the Continental Army was a force in being, and they just couldn't trap the Continental Army. And as long as the force in being, the British were definitely not losing the war, but they weren't winning it either. And so, having failed to achieve results in the North, the British acquired a new, really, it was more of a political strategy than a military strategy, but it was to shift the bulk of their military effort to the South, particularly South Carolina. And the idea was to recapture South Carolina and then pursue a conciliatory policy toward the South Carolinians. So they would obviously fight the Continental Army and the South Carolina militia and so forth, but in order to retake South Carolina. But then their political policy was going to be very mild, and the idea was to show the other colonies, as the British regarded them, hey, look, you have nothing to fear from coming back into the British Empire. Look at how mildly and justly we are treating South Carolina. So that was the plan. That was the idea. What actually happened was when the British arrived in South Carolina and won victories and moved on into South Carolina, this emboldened the loyalists and the loyalist militia, to go from being on the defensive and being persecuted by the revolutionary militia and so forth, and to take the field and to fight the revolutionaries on favorable terms and go after the revolutionary civilians, that had persecuted their own population. And basically, it was payback time from the loyalist standpoint. And this was kind of a disaster for the British Army and the British government, because the loyalists, their military efforts and how draconian these efforts were, just destroyed any idea that some kind of conciliatory policy was going on in South Carolina. And so the British Army didn't succeed there either. And so the British general there, a guy named Cornwallis, actually, won every engagement that he fought in South Carolina, but achieved no firm results, and found himself, needing to move to a place where he could resupply his army safely, and began a march toward a small seaport town called Yorktown, Virginia. This required him to cross North Carolina, and in March of 1781, there was a battle in Piedmont, North Carolina, central North Carolina, called the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And this was a battle that the Continental Army and the militia lost, but they lost it. Basically, they inflicted so many casualties on the British Army that another such victory would have ruined the British Army. So this showed that the Americans were capable of hanging tough. Again, during this period, the main job of the Continental Army was to survive. And Guilford Courthouse and what's going on in South Carolina and North Carolina really brings out the importance of the revolutionary militia. It was of limited utility on the battlefield. There was one battle in South Carolina, the Battle of Camden, where the militia just ran. I mean, it was not at all pretty. They did better at Guilford Courthouse, but where they excelled was in terms of the intimidation of the population. You see, ultimately, what both sides were fighting for, they weren't fighting to defeat each other's army. What they were fighting for, what their objective was the allegiance of the American population. And remember that many of these Americans were neutral or passive or loyalists. And so what goes on is something that a prominent military historian called triangularity of struggle. So part of the top of the triangle are the armies fighting each other, and then the other part of the triangle pointing downward is the allegiance, or is the population itself. I'm not going to quote this to you, but it's just going to be there on the PDF. The military historian's name is John Shai. And basically what he argues is that the two armed forces are trying to get the support and control of the civilian population. And what happens in the War for American Independence is this: the Americans come through, and if you're neutral or passive or whatever, you got to play ball with the revolutionaries, or things go bad for you. Then the British Army comes through, and then you got to play ball with the British Army and supply them, and so forth, or they're gonna go after you. And then another thing that happens is the the revolutionaries will call out the militia from time to time, and then that forces you to choose because you have militia duty that you have to do. So you either turn out and declare yourself as a revolutionary, whether you like it or not, or you don't turn out, and then that makes you look like a loyalist and a traitor. And what the American population learned over time is that the British Army might come through and then disappear, but the revolutionary forces, the militia, were always going to come back, always going to come back. And so ultimately, the American population, even if they were passive or neutral or didn't care or whatever, they realized, you know, we have to side for our own well-being. We have to side with the revolutionaries. And ultimately, in that sense, you can argue that the militia played a major role in the ultimate American victory because they were the ones who, really, as much as anyone, secured the allegiance of the American population. The British tried to regain the allegiance of the American population. They couldn't do it. The militia, though, were the ones that made sure that the revolutionaries gained that allegiance. Now, the final campaign that we need to look at is the one that occurs in Yorktown, Virginia. And Yorktown, if you've ever been to Colonial Williamsburg, Yorktown is on the York River, a few miles north of Williamsburg. It's on this river, obviously called the York River. The York River empties into the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay, of course, flows outward into the Atlantic Ocean. The Chesapeake Bay has two capes. One is called Cape Henry. One is called Cape Charles. That they command. Those are the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. And in September, in the spring of 1781, Washington and the commander of the French Expeditionary Force, a guy named Rochambeau, moved from the New York area down to Yorktown with the idea of trying to capture Cornwallis's army. Now, you might think that this was Washington's idea. In fact, Washington was fixated on the recapture of New York. What happened was a French admiral, his name was de Grasse, he had been operating in the Caribbean Sea and so forth, but he decided, hey, I can come up into the North American waters, and what I can do is I can close off access to the Chesapeake Bay. And so he sends this, this communication, this proposal privately to the French General Rochambeau, and they decide this is a really good idea. And so basically, Rochambeau politely says to Washington, "Hey, we have this opportunity here, to corral Cornwallis at Yorktown. Why don't we do it?" And Washington, in the situation is fine. The French fleet is going to show up, their army's going to show up. Let's do it. But it really wasn't Washington's idea. It was Admiral de Grasse's idea. It's just one of those things that one of those interesting things about about history and the way things play out. So de Grasse is as good as his word. On September 5th, 1781, his fleet stands just outside of the entrance to Chesapeake Bay. And a British fleet comes along trying to break into Chesapeake Bay because if it can break into Chesapeake Bay, it can reach Cornwallis's army at Yorktown, resupply it, reinforce it, maybe evacuate it, but do something with Cornwallis to get him out of this, this trap that the Americans and the French are creating for him. Well, the French win. De Grasse wins this battle, and the British fleet has to pull off, and Cornwallis is now surrounded by a combined force of French and Americans. There's nowhere that he can go. This map, if you don't see many military maps, what you're looking at, if you look at the town of Yorktown, and then you look at these little black lines around it, those are the defensive British trenches and bastions and so forth. And then if you look beyond it, you will see where the Americans and the French are advancing on Yorktown. And if you look at the numbers that are involved, this is what the numbers work out to be. So the British have a total of 10,500. Check this out. The Americans have a total of 10,000, of whom only 5,900 are actually engaged in this siege of Yorktown. The French bring 10,800 soldiers and 29 warships. And more than that, the French were the best in the world at besieging fortifications. They had it down to a science. And so when Cornwallis, realized that the French and the Americans had gotten close enough, using these siegecraft tactics, that the next thing they could do was storm the British works successfully. He realized that he would need to ask for terms for surrender. 2 days later, he did surrender. He refused to go out personally to surrender. He sent a subordinate to do it. And significantly, the subordinate went to Rochambeau, the French general, to present the sword of surrender. As far as the British were concerned, it wasn't the Americans who had beaten them at Yorktown, it was the French. French had the larger army, they had the siegecraft know-how, they had the fleet that had isolated Cornwallis. It was a French victory. The Americans were just along for their ride. And what Rochambeau had to do was point, to George Washington and basically say, that's the guy you surrender to. You're going to surrender to George Washington. Um, and that is what happened. Now, the theoretically, the British government could have continued to fight. They could have sent another army over. The British had lost some 10,000, troops in the surrender at Yorktown, but they had a lot more troops, over in Europe that they could have sent over. But they decided it just wasn't worth it. There was no obvious way to defeat the Americans. They had tried various things and they'd won victories, but the victories went nowhere. It was costing a lot of money. They were having to fight the French, the Spanish, the Dutch in in European waters. They were in danger of losing the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean that produced a lot more wealth than the North American colonies ever had. And the British government just decided, you know, to suspend active operations. The the war, however, did not end until 1783. And what you're looking at um, is a painting of the American peace commissioners that were sent to England to negotiate the peace treaty with the English. And it's unfinished because the painter expected to have the British negotiators, also in the painting, and they refused to appear. So this is the best we've got in terms of visual portrayal of the peace negotiations. Uh, it took almost 2 more years after Yorktown this for peace to be negotiated. Part of the problem was the alliance that the Americans had contracted. They'd gotten what they wanted, from the war, and the French help had been invaluable. But remember, the alliance said that neither side could conclude a separate peace. And that meant that the Americans could not conclude a peace treaty with the British until the French were ready to conclude a peace treaty with the British. And the French were still fighting the British very actively. Um, Further complicating matters, Spain had entered the war in 1779, but was allied only to France, not to America, and had aspirations to limiting American expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And so they weren't really, in a mood to help out the Americans. Uh, and so the and then another thing that was going on, in all this is that the Americans were actually somewhat suspicious of the French. They felt like the French were trying to sort of drag out the war uh, in such a way as to work to the advantage of the French. not the Americans. And what happened quietly, and the French kind of just accepted this, is that the Americans did in fact negotiate a separate peace with Great Britain for all practical uh, purposes. This is what the peace treaty ultimately looked like. Uh, the Americans gained independence, that's for sure, and you can see that the area that they gained independence of was the 13 states now, and then the area beyond the Appalachian Mountains, which they had coveted for a long time, and this mostly consisted of what was then called the Ohio Country. So as far as present day Minnesota in some respects, you can see that the Spanish controlled Florida and Spanish Louisiana, and then there were some disputed areas between the United States and Spain because it had been disputed between the British and Spain before that. So this is the lay of the land. The Americans got certain important fishing rights, which sounds pretty arcane to us, but it was important to the Americans at that particular time. They could fish off of the shores of Labrador and Nova Scotia. The British agreed to withdraw all their forces from American soil with, quote, all convenient speed. They actually maintained 6 forts on American soil for a number of years thereafter. Congress said that it would not that it would urge the states not to confiscate the property of loyalists. But that was all the negotiators could do is, we will encourage the states not to confiscate the property of loyalists. Well, guess what? The states did it anyway. And some 125,000 loyalists, these were American colonists or Americans who would remain loyal to the king. They were forced into exile. You know, many of them to Ontario, and you'll find the descendants of loyalists there to this day. About 125,000 were exiled in that fashion. So this final piece, the Treaty of Paris, obviously signed in Paris in 1783, you know, concluded the war for American independence. The Americans had made a nation. Now they had to make a government capable of managing it.